Dear participant, yesterday we discussed the institutional setup, the framework for PPP model and practices. We discussed why PPP. We went through the form of PPP. We discussed the suitable candidate for PPP. We also discussed the prerequisites to do a PPP. We discussed the benefit and pitfalls that we have to be watching while we do PPP. And also we give a very brief overview about your country infrastructure challenges and the role of public-private sector. Of course, in the role of the public-private sector, you have to go through an evolution. Myanmar, like other countries, will go through that transformation. And there are other examples. Egypt, Turkey, where we have seen a movement in the PPP in very modular way, in very evolutive way. For instance, some of the holding company used to be run by some of the biggest military part of the country. Over the years, especially in the manufacturing business, this has moved to private sector. It had done in a very evolutionary way. It was done in a very interesting way, actually, where the private sector was able to join effort and either do PPP or buy some of these assets. So there is, as I said earlier in the first model, we don't have one size fits all. PPP is a flexible model that is applicable to almost all countries. But you have to look at your framework, the way you do business, and then you will have to adapt to it. It's not an overnight change that you will have to introduce. It's a very modular way. And therefore, for sectors like power sector, water sector, highway, that's a normal way to start doing PPP. And that's where the private sector will be interested. And there will not be any conflict for some of the traditional basic of your economy. That's what Turkey has done. That's what Egypt has done. That some of the African countries have done, like Nigeria, Tanzania, Uganda, or others. So now what we're going to discuss today is the PPP enabling environment, the legal regulatory framework. And that enabling environment is applicable to everybody, to the public sector, to private sector, to other shareholders, to NGO community. Everybody will be within that framework when we will do PPP. So if some of the existing holders of assets or operation in your country would like to join and would like to bid for those PPP, they can do it, but they have to do it within the same framework, within the same rule, which are fair to everybody. And that's what country like Egypt, country like Nigeria, country like Turkey, country like Morocco, country like Uruguay, Brazil, Argentina have done over the years when they introduced PPP. So today we will talk about the legal framework. We will discuss the legislation relevant to PPP, and we will talk about general specific issue and specific issue at the same time. But we have here, first of all, what is a framework of PPP? Because some countries, as I said yesterday, prefer to go with what we call regulation by contract. In other words, they will say, I am going to sign a contract with the private sector. I will then put in that contract all the necessarily legal clauses to protect me as government, and also to protect the private sector. And also in case of issue, what would be the resolution system to put in place? Regulation by contract works, but it has some limit, especially if you are going through some ambitious program. The major problem of regulation by contract is predictability. It does not give us a clear sign, where are you going next? So if I'm a private sector who would like to raise money from the capital market, the first thing my banker in Europe or United States will ask me, what is the legal framework on which you're going to operate this PPP? If I say, well, we don't have one, we're going to have a contract, it will create suspicion. Moreover, it will be more expensive to raise money when there are no legal predictability. And therefore, the PPP framework consists of policy, procedure, processes, and rule that they can together define how the PPP program will be working, how companies will be selected, put on the priority list, budgeted for, procured, monitored, and of course, who is responsible of what. To establish a PPP framework, you need to have basically promoting three basic principles: accountability, transparency, and integrity. And integrity of the process is extremely important to show that this is transparent and everybody will get a fair treatment in the process of doing the PPP. As we said earlier, there is no single model for PPP framework. It's typically evolved over time and often in response to specific challenges facing the PPP program. The United Nations Economic Commission for Europe has done a lot of work for Europe at that time on defining good governance for PPP. This was in the context of the collapse of the former Soviet Union, when Eastern Europe moved from model to another model, when the transition has to be much more aggressive toward involving the private sector. So they prepared a guidebook, which is a very good one actually, and you have the reference in it, about good governance. And it's saying it has to be done in an efficient way, again, accountability, of course, transparency, decency, which means development and implementation of rule without harming people, and that's an important aspect, fairness, and participation and involvement of all stakeholders. The participation is important, and we need to keep in mind, as I said early on when we started this model, the other models, and the three PPP, the most important one, at least in my view, is the second one. Public-private partnership, sorry, is the third one, the partnership part. The partnership, which includes also participation of stakeholders, involvement in them. There will be cases where you will need to see their view. There will be environmental assessment, social assessment. When you do some large project that will involve resettlement of people, you need to listen to people's concern. You have to address people's concern. And that could be a good way of looking at PPP. The key question that we could ask ourselves, how can government best facilitate the development of the project? Of course, the basic assumption, as I said in the last module, is that you need to have the political will to do reform. Once you have accepted that argument, then how can you help make the deal fair, transparent to everybody, and make it happen? That's the first question we ask ourselves. The second question, what can government do to foster PPP enabling environment? The government cannot sit and wait for the private sector just to come and invest in your country or any other country. You have to be active to attract investors in your country. We have to keep in mind, Myanmar will not be the only country doing PPP. Many countries, I count around 100 countries around the world right now doing PPP. So investors are looking around the world for good, bankable project that will get them good rate of return and a good enabling environment where they can operate, and also want to ensure that when they go into a new project, they can carry it out during the life of the project without too many problems. So the question again here, what can government do to foster the enabling environment for public-private partnership? Which brings us to the question, why a legal framework? Is to persuade the investor to put their money and others in long-term investment and to allow the government to be able to attract the private sector. And I think this is an important aspect that you have to keep in mind as you go on. The next question is, yes, for a legal framework. But as you heard me a few times, I talk always about legal framework, and then I refer to regulatory framework. They go together. The regulatory framework is important so that the contract can operate over a long period of time in a manner that is fair, transparent, and equitable to all stakeholders. And that's a very important, this aspect of the way the contract will be functioning. So we talk about conciliating the objective. One of the biggest challenges in any PPP It's sometimes to reconcile different objectives of the various interested actors in such a way that each party stands to gain if the project is successfully completed. What we want is to create win-win for the public sector, for the private sector, for the citizen that will be beneficiary of this project. Although such objective sometimes could be difficult to reconcile in the short term, they are often found to match in the medium to long term. So I will be patient when I will do PPP. I will not expect everything to happen in the first 18 months of the project. We talk about projects that are 25 years sometimes. So we have to be patient to see result, especially tangible result. The legal framework assessment that usually countries do when they start the program, and I would strongly recommend to Myanmar to do this kind of legal framework assessment. Provide a summary of the key area of host country existing law that will need to be reviewed when a government embarks in the major infrastructure project, particularly one involved in the private sector. You have to look at tax law, you have to look at labor law, you have to look at environmental law, you have to look at social law, you have to look at different economic laws that could affect one way or another a project. So it's not just one law here and one law there. So it's in a legal framework assessment is a good first step as you define your new legal framework to allow public-private partnership. The aim of the public authority is to target the project suitable for PPP and to create the enabling environment for them to succeed. So don't be surprised when you will do your PPP that sometimes you will have a conciliate objective. Sometimes some objective will be contradictory. That's normal. I wouldn't be nervous too much for that because a public-private partnership project is a complex process and it will take time. And as you prepare, as you implement, it's learning by doing. You will see at the end, it will become a normal way of doing business, like what we have seen in Europe, in particular in Germany, in the UK, and Italy, and many other European countries where they have been succeeding in putting in place a PPP system that now almost works on its own, on remote control, if I allow me to say. Experienced infrastructure PPP across the globe suggests that there are three institutional pillars that are needed to increase the probability of PPP success. And I lived personally this kind of experience in many countries where I work over the last 40 years. First, I always insist on the political will, which means the political commitment to champion and to support the agenda. It's not sufficient to say, I am country X and I would love to do a PPP program. That's not enough. You will need to have the government, the head of state, the parliament. Everybody should be convinced that this new way of doing business is the right way, should be pursued, and should be supported. So the political will is one of the strongest elements that could send a very strong message to the marketplace and to the future investor that you are serious in doing business and that you are attractive. It's part of the doing business. The second one is the institution and governance. Who does what? The legal framework, processes, and also you cannot simply start by saying, I'm going to do a PPP this way, competitive bid. Then, by the way, no, I changed my mind. I'm going to do it that way. Oh, no, I'm going to do it that way. No, you have to be consistent. You have to give clear signal. Standardization is important aspect because people, again, would like to have predictability on the way you do business, how you do business, and what are the different elements of doing that business. The third aspect, which is important for a PPP, you need to have a strong project team to be able to prepare the project, to be able to launch the bid, to be able to compare the different bid, to be able to look at the financial, legal, risk, environmental, social aspect of the PPP, and to be able then to manage implementation. You need project team, and these are people that will have to spend almost full time working on these projects. Many countries created PPP unit in the Prime Minister office or in the Ministry of Finance or in the president office or wherever it is. But those units, they have full-time job to work on those projects. And I've seen a successful one. South Africa is a good example where we have seen this unit functioning and being able to be very transparent, very efficient, and put bids on the table and be able to compare them and to analyze them and to really declare who's winning. So the skills of the people that you will need to bring in this unit or in this framework is very important. We need good lawyers, good financial analysts, good economists, good social people, good environment, and especially good technical engineers, because we are talking about a project which are basically technical project. If it's a power project, you need to know somebody who know exactly how a power generation function, what are different elements, what kind of input you would like to do to call for. Is it a project on gas or on heavy fuel, etc. So you need to have good technical team behind you in the project team. The project team is not only about financial people. No, it has to be multi-skills of different people working together toward achieving the objective of the project. We talked about the political will. I already give you in the introduction my views on this. In a PPP design, company assume the risk of construction, operation, and financing under a long-term contract. In traditional procurement, by contract, the works are paid in advance. That's why the difference between the two ways of doing business. But the whole idea of the provision of infrastructure and service by the private sector is to change from the status quo of doing business. And that's why in many countries, securing buy-in for PPP require a strong political will. I talked about the institution already. What is very important, transactions that are subject to approval from different branches of the government require sometimes approval by the parliament. I have seen in countries like Lebanon, every single project will have to go to the parliament. This many times delay process of implementation, and sometimes the project is killed before even it's approved. So you have to be careful, you have to be very efficient, especially that if you take your time too long to require government approval, parliament approval, presidential approval, decree here, decree there, the interests of the private sector could be gone and they will decide to go somewhere else. But on the other hand, excessively fast procedures are likely also to create some problems here, because they could bring bring you expensive bids. So you have to be careful. So what we are saying here, fast procedures are likely to scare off high quality bidder as well. In other words, is that the good quality bidder like to see things done properly. Not just because preparing quality bid requires time, but because the whole process could become complicated as you go on. So it's keep in mind the balance between efficiency and at the same time standardization of this project. Therefore, the aspect of institution and governance of these PPP projects is crucial as you develop your program. Technical team, we talked about it already, but the strong technical team government is perhaps the most even important for contract management during implementation phase. It's easy to win a contract for the private sector. It's easy even to award the contract for the public sector. But the devil's in the detail in implementation. And that's where most of the problems start emerging. Sometimes these are engineering problems. Sometimes these are financing problems. Sometimes these are guarantee problems. Sometimes sovereign guarantee problems. So PPP are a sophisticated business that require very specific and strong financial, legal, technical skill to set the level of service, the allocation of risk, the mitigation measures, the project finance way of doing business, the legal framework, and the contract monitoring based on outcome. Each of that aspect, when you start implementation, could become problematic. So you have to be alert and you need to have experience about how to deal with those problems. Those problems could be solved easily. Sometimes they require much more sophisticated skills that you can call upon from the international community, from the local private sector, from the government itself. I'm not worried about that. But government should expect that firm investing large sum of money into a project will use the best legal framework. Keep in mind that any PPP, when the private sector try to bid on it, prepare a bid, and use the best financial people and engineer and lawyers to prepare that bid and win it, it costs them a lot of money. And usually 10% of project cost is for preparation of a project. 10%, that's a lot of money. I have seen in countries where sometimes it's up to $10 million. And in countries like Laos, which you know pretty well, when we did one of the largest hydropower projects, it cost the operator $50 million just in preparing for the project. $50 million. For the World Bank, put another $10 million. So you have to expect some very large project will be expensive to prepare. And the government will need to have a sophisticated team, but the private sector, for sure, they will always have the best skill to help them and to advise them, because this is their money they're putting in this project. The question then will be, okay, we've seen the three pillars, but what exactly, as a government, I should do in PPP? What we say here is that a healthy public-private partnership has several defining features: strong competition, bankability with low financial cost, lower risk of renegotiation. You need to secure value for money and efficiency gain. And when a government decides to allow the private sector to develop a project, it should have the following objective, in my opinion. It should satisfy the public interest in having the project completed on time. If I decided to go with the PPP because I need the power to be delivered to the people quickly, or I need the water supply and the drinking water to be delivered, or I need the road to be built so that I can have my transport system functioning properly. We need also to bring the project back into public ownership when the private sector received an acceptable return. So sometimes I say, okay, I don't have the money now, so I'm going to give this PPP for 25 years. And then after 25 years, when the concession agreement is done, I want to take it back as a government and operate it. That's a fair objective. But during that period, you want to assure that the private sector who put its own money, who built it, who implemented, who operated it, get a good rate of return on their investment. And for instance, in the power sector, I expect a rate of return over 20% on my investment if I want me to stay with you for 20 years. It's not 5%. For 5%, I will not come. One of the sectors which is the less attractive to the private sector, the water sector, where the rate of return are around 10%. But still, we've seen some people taking risk and saying, I'm going to go with this project, PPP, and I'm going to try to make some money. The third objective would be to have adequate safeguard and assurance that the project will be operated properly and safely. What we want to make sure is that these PPP projects don't become a public problem when they are privately operated. Therefore, if this is a water project, you have to ensure that the standard of water quality is done properly. When you talk about power project, you need to make sure that the electricity is delivered properly, you don't have blackout, that there's continuity, and the price is affordable. You want also to reduce or eliminate the need to use taxpayers' money or government borrowing when you do the PPP. Most of the government will use this budgetary or this fiscal reason why they do PPP. They cannot afford it under the budget. The Minister of Finance usually give enough budget for each sector ministry, but not enough to do large projects. And therefore, when you go and do PPP project, it's off budget, off balance sheet, and it's on the private sector, basically. Most of the time, all what you have to do is to give a sovereign guarantee. And sometimes it has to be backed up by international guarantee. You also, objective is to benefit from the private sector know-how and technology while keeping the government discretion and restricted as far as possible. The private sector will bring you a lot of knowledge, technology know-how, that you can later on decide if you take over these assets to run like the private sector. And we've seen some countries like Morocco, where the public sector companies are able to function like private sector companies. It is feasible. But to do that, you will need to have a clear objective that the government is not here to interfere in the way of doing business. Government is here to facilitate doing business, and priority is to get international and local private sector bring you the know-how, the technology, and the way you do business so that those PPP succeed. So the enabling framework for PPP project, it has been described by these two components. As I said earlier, legislation and regulation and contract. A PPP framework is not something carved in stone forever that should be adopted, implemented universally, and we say, that's it. On the opposite. It's infinitely diverse in the form of combination of these two components. Sometimes legislation will have a lot of aspects of the PPP way of doing business. Sometimes the regulation in the contract will have more aspects than legislation. Legislation will give the legal framework, how it will operate, then the regulation will go into specific issue, and the contract will go into the implementation, what are the standards, what are the performance, what is the metrics, etc., etc. Some countries have developed private sector protection road infrastructure without specific PPP legislation, leaving it to the party. And this is purely on contractual basis. But I already told you, the problem is going only on contractual basis. Sometimes it works in some sector. It attracts some private sector investors. But it's not sufficient if you are ambitious for a full PPP program in different sector, water, energy, gas, health, education, etc., etc. So it's very important to have a combination of a general legal framework. If you don't want to do a general legal framework and you decide to put priority on specific sectors where you would like to do PPP, then you can do specific sector legislation for PPPs. Water PPP legislation, power PPP legislation, transport PPP legislation. But to be honest with you, I personally, from my experience, I prefer to go with a PPP legal framework, which gives you the enabling environment, which sends signals to the marketplace of how you do business. Then I will look into the regulation and the contract that are specific to each sector. So I do not recommend to have 15 legislation by sector, especially if they are completely different one from each other. It will be confusing what kind of signals you will be sending to the marketplace. But some countries have done it. So the law in contract examines legal framework, as we said already. It provides the diagnosis of the reform and provide the basic for preparation of the contract. The legislation look also at the institutional framework. It doesn't look only at legal framework. It look at the institutional framework that could foster private investment. And each legal system in each country has its own source of law, with some good rate places on some aspect. In developing an infrastructure project, it's very important to identify which source of law applied in the host country and the relative weighting. Because sometimes you could have a large company coming from overseas. The first question will tell you, I am already subject to some legislation in my own coming country. And now it contradicts your legislation. How can we operate? Especially when there are problems and you have to go through resolution. So it's very important to have that balance between the regulatory assessment and the institutional framework and the framework adjustment, and to be flexible when you look at it. When we look at the contract, each PPP is unique and involves public and private partners, international institutions, often to participate to enhance the project. The contractual framework for a PPP project involves a web of independent contractual relation obligation around one main agreement. For instance, in the power sector, we have what we call the PPP contract, which is the one. Sometimes we call it the take or pay contract. In the power sector, it's very sophisticated. You have the main agreement, and you have sub-agreements that are associated to that. You can have the maintenance contract, you have the construction subcontract, etc. It depends also of how far you are going into your concession. Is it for 15 years, 25 years? Is it BOT, BOOT? And we'll talk about it later on. If we look at some case studies, Chile was among the first countries who has done a lot of PPP. I recall Chile is a country with substantial experience and a well-defined PPP framework. A few years ago, they had around 60 projects, road, airport, jail, reservoir, urban transport, everything, with a total investment of 10.8 billion. Now they have over 70 projects because this became a normal project. Chile was an example for the rest of the world, especially in Latin America. The legislation, first time it was enabled in 1991 by decree. We set out much of the framework, which is still in use actually. And this framework was only updated in 2020 by a concession law because then they get more sophisticated. On that basis, we've seen countries like Colombia following that example, Argentina also, Uruguay, good thing, Brazil. Most of Latin America followed the example of Chile, and most of the rest of the world also look at it. It's a good example because, frankly, it allowed to raise a lot of money. It diversified. It's not only infrastructure. It went into complicated sector like urban transport. It went also in hospital, where it's not easy to go and give private sector involvement to run a hospital. And also, it brings a lot of money in the country. If I go to a country like Peru, for instance, which I know very well, Peru is a country which was able also to develop good PPP projects in education, in health, in infrastructure. The case of the framework that they've done in Chile is that the concession unit by the Ministry of Public Work, which basically the one that was doing procurement, set out the institutional responsibility. Then you have the National Planning Authority review and approve the technical economic analysis. And the Ministry of Finance approved the tender document because it could have some financial and fiscal implication. And Chile publicly disclosed its commitment to the PPP project in a detailed annual contingent liability report. That's an important aspect. We have to be transparent and we have to say to the people what we are doing. And I think it's important. We have to explain how we're doing business, what we are doing, and when we're going to do it. It's important to show the pipeline to the people. South Africa is another good example. South Africa has developed a very, very substantial PPP experience in all sectors. From 2000 to 2014, during 14 years, they implemented 24 national and provincial level of PPP with over $8 billion of investment. The legislation governing national provincial PPP is a treasury regulation, the Ministry of Finance basically, which was issued in 1999. Then you have around 16 regulations that explain the process, procurement, approval, institution. And they have all put this in a PPP manual, which is very well organized. To conclude, when we look at the legal and regulatory framework, it's very important to have the enabling legislation at the national level very clear on how we will do the PPP. This should be followed by a set of regulations that will set out the process, the responsibility, the requirement, the approval, and the institutional responsibility and accountability. It's very important. This complementary regulation to the legislation is an important factor. Then you have the contract itself, which need to have clear metrics of implementation, performance indicator, what would happen in the case of recourse, what court we will have to go to, what kind of financial commitment from each party. The contract also will have to be detailed. So the three pieces, the legislation, regulation, and contract, is what we call a PPP framework for a good enabling environment to attract the private sector in those sectors. Thank you.